Thank you for listening to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. Sign up to our Patreon to receive bonus content, live streams, and our weekly newsletter with money off books and museum visits as well, plus early access to all live show tickets. That's patreon.com/wehaveways.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Upgrade your business with Shopify, home of the #1 checkout on the planet. Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%, meaning fewer carts going abandoned and more sales going cha-ching. So if you're into growing your business, get a commerce platform that's ready to sell wherever your customers are. Visit shopify.com to upgrade your selling today.
¿Hablas español?
Sprichst du Deutsch?
Kann du noch?
If you've had that sound from Babbel before, I bet you do. Babbel is the science-backed language learning app that actually works. With quick 10-minute lessons handcrafted by over 200 language experts, Babbel gets you on your way to speaking a new language in just a few weeks. With over 16 million subscriptions sold and a 20-day money-back guarantee, just start speaking another language with Babbel. Right now, up to 55% off your Babbel subscription at babbel.com/Spotify podcast. Spelled BABBEL.com/Spotify podcast. Rules and restrictions may apply.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states or situations.
This episode explores topics that some may find disturbing. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk with me, Al Murray, and James Holland. And we are joined for this fourth in our series of episodes about Auschwitz and the Holocaust with a very special guest, aren't we, James?
Yeah, we have. He's a barrister, a TV star, a TV judge. Of course it is, Rob Rinder.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Oh, no, it's a pleasure. Thank you for coming on.
Yes, and squeezing us into your busy schedule, because you're a very, very busy man. And honorary colonel, of course, which much to James's chagrin, that makes 2 out of 3. You're outnumbered, Jim.
Royal Corps of Armed Music, big shout out to them.
I know. But as discussed, you get to wear scarlet, and that's all that matters.
I do, and I do enjoy it.
Yeah. Why wouldn't you? I mean...
But Rob, you've been very, very you've been honoured for your work in Holocaust memorial advocacy, haven't you? And people may know this about you from the programmes you've made and the Who Do You Think You Are, where you went through your family history, and the subsequent programmes you made with your mother about your family.
Which were incredibly moving, I should hasten to add.
Staggeringly moving. And also to see someone in the public eye, and you're perhaps known for, you'd just done Strictly when you did Who Do You Think You Are, someone known for sort of being an entertainer, to then revealing this stuff and confronting this stuff in your past, your family's past. 2 questions really to ask. I may not go as far as the second one. Is this a thing that you've always felt as part of your life that you've had to confront and talk about? Or is it a thing that came to you as you grew older?
I think the thing is that it was inescapable. So my grandfather, for anyone listening who hasn't seen the Who Do You Think You Are, and then the subsequent program, The Holocaust, My Family and Me, my grandfather's a central presence in my life, our family's life. My mum was a single mum, and so my grandma and my grandfather, Zeta, as we would call him, that's the Yiddish word for grandfather, was always there. And what I knew from as young an age as I can possibly remember is that there was dark silences around him. So even though he was very explosive and highly eccentric, there were certain doors that you didn't open, and there were whispers, what he's been through. And if anybody, any of your listeners or anybody who has a parent or grandparent or relative who's experienced trauma, and it's true, you will have had this no doubt through your programs, I know, of people talking about the Second World War. Kids, the first generation, tend not to ask their parents because they know that beyond the dark recesses of that door, you just don't ask any questions. So growing up, I was always aware that he was a Holocaust survivor. And from time to time, he would tell us stories, almost sort of out of nowhere. You never knew when it was going to come. It was completely capricious. One day, I might say something that happened at school, and he'd have a story.
And he would always prompt that, would he? It would always come from him. You wouldn't ask him.
Oh, absolutely. You never asked. I mean, so often it's the case, I'm sure, that the heroic generation from the Second World War, grandchildren and great-grandchildren now ask parents and grandparents, why didn't you ask your father that? And the answer to that is because I couldn't. I knew not to. It had to come from him. But I knew the sort of dark outlines of what had happened, but not the full facts, not all of it, the complexion. And so I knew he had 4 sisters and a brother who had been murdered in Treblinka along with his parents. That I knew. And actually, I went back with him to the town he'd grown up in 1998. And I'd imagined that it was a world rather like, how can I think of it, as a shtetl, which is a Yiddish word. Imagine any of you thinking, if you've seen Fiddler on the Roof, you know what I mean, as a small kind of farming backwater. That's what I'd grown up with in my mind. And of course, the most important thing to remember is that across Europe and even in Poland, where he'd come from, in Piotrków-Trybunalski, this was very much, despite its poverty, the developed world, full of modernity and communities living alongside one another, and the entire buffet of the things that we look around us now and think keep us safe, a sort of degree of plurality, different faiths, no faiths, and so on and so forth. And even at that point, he didn't really say very much. But there was one encounter which I'll never forget. He lived in a sort of apartment block, let's say, when there were all Jewish families apart from one. And I was walking up the stairs. There was a missing banister where he'd fallen through that as a child. And to think of your grandfather as a child is such an extraordinary thing. We always see our grandparents fixed in time in the heroic moment that we come to know them. And I looked through a window and there was his wallpaper, same as it was as his child. And this was just around that time in eastern Poland when the last vestiges of communism and was sort of still there. So it was kind of disintegrating, but nevertheless still around. In fact, the glass factory where he'd been a slave laborer was still operating.
How amazing.
It's quite something. And as we came down the stairs, there was this woman who came out of her flat. And there's no real way of sort of describing it. Safe to say that he looked at her and she sort of touched him. I don't know how long the encounter lasted, maybe a second, maybe a moment, I don't know. They exchanged words and they walked away from one another. And it turned out that she had been the daughter of the only non-Jewish family who had lived in that block of flats. And she had no idea that he had survived. And there he was, standing there with
amazing
his daughter and his 2 grandsons.
My God.
And he looked at her and she touched him. And in that 30 seconds was the most electric, profound connection. For me, that's where faith is. But it was a moment of electric humanity that I've never forgotten. But even then, I didn't get the full details until I did Who Do You Think You Are? And from there, because of the interest there was in it, which I was really delighted by, there wasn't a single element, not a moment of anti-Jewish racism. There was nothing but authentic and kind curiosity. And also, and I certainly was the least well-known person in that cohort of people whose lives the program was exploring. It was really widely watched, honestly, with a genuine thirst for people to know more. And then from there, it struck me that seeing as I had a public platform in some way, that it was a gift, an opportunity, right, to share not just my grandfather's life, but the lives of the other survivors, and to teach and share those lessons.
And Rob, your grandfather was called Morris Malanicki, is that right? That's how you pronounce it?
Yeah, Malanitsky.
Malanitsky, yeah.
Yeah.
And one of the things I always think is interesting about sort of connecting to the past is the Second World War era, although colour photography was in place by then, it's basically a monochrome world
So
that we've got to look at. And I'm wondering, when you went into that house and you're looking at that wallpaper and you're seeing it in 3D and you're seeing it in colour, did that bring it closer to you?
That's such an important thing to say when I'm thinking about sharing these stories. It's really important to bring it into colour. What I mean is, often we look at the Second World War, you think of, or even films like, let's say, Schindler's List, and you see it through the lens of black and white. And that's quite alienating. It feels like the dark recesses of the past beyond the fingertips of the now, right?
Yeah.
But as with all history, I mean, You go to the Tower of London and you look at a brick, and if you squint enough and crowd out the noise of the flight path into Heathrow, you share a common consciousness, a connection, let's say, with Anne Boleyn on the way to the block, right?
Yeah.
So to stand in all of its colour, the greenness of the grass,
Yes.
the colour, as you say, of the wallpaper, it brings it completely into the present. All these buildings are quite literally like time machines. They don't just have the imprint of human memory. They're where lives were lived. And one of the challenges of discussing the Holocaust and your brilliant program and important program about Auschwitz is that it's so vital to remember that that's the end of the story, that place with all of its complexity and matchless horror. But we need to remember the beginning with all of its color and all of the lives that were lost. And in my grandfather's case, Malinitsky, because he was in Poland in that town for 300 years. I mean, if you think about where that takes us back from here, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, it is amazing how many communities were completely destroyed. And it's not just in the former Soviet Union or in the East or Jewish communities. Throughout the war, there are everywhere where there was violence and the war was fought, villages are getting uprooted and completely destroyed, whether it be Burma or islands in the Pacific, or, Al and I have talked a lot about a little village in Italy called San Pietro. And, the way of life there just continued, the rhythms of the seasons year after year. The only thing that changed was sort of people's clothing a bit. And rural Italy, for example, in the beginning of the war was just the same as it had been, 100 years before, and very untouched by political events, really. These are total outposts, just been going on, and families intermarrying, and, centuries and centuries and centuries of a way of life. Then suddenly gone. It's that terrible, catastrophic change, uprooting, wiping out, annihilation that I think is so shocking. And of course, people 80 years ago felt exactly the same as we do today. They still, loved, disliked, felt for their children, their husbands, worried, had anxieties, were happy, laughed, were sad, shed tears, roared uproariously in exactly the same way as we do today. You have to make a connection to that people, to that generation. You have to put yourselves beyond the black and white photograph. You have to realize that these are real people just like you and I, just caught up in something just completely barbaric and horrific.
Well, I wonder whether, not just putting it into color, let's say, or is on its own important. It's also this sense of modernity. That's what I think is a sort of another essential complexion to all of this. Here we are talking to each other sort of on the internet, and we think we're kind of in the modern world and cushioned from, let's say, the descent into barbarism because there's a McDonald's up the road and I can do this remotely, right?
Well, I think it's accelerating if we're not careful.
Well, precisely. And made me think, not long ago, we talk about being a colonel of the Royal Court of Army Music. I went to the Musikverein in Vienna. And, everybody there's got a PhD, even the people that sell ice cream and stuff. And I noticed, I looked down, it was the 9th of November. I thought, oh God, I forgot my mum's birthday. And then I remember actually it's another significant date. So I asked, could they tell me what the repertoire was on this day in 1938? Sure, no problem. Got back to the hotel. I don't speak German, but they sent me the program. Karl Böhm conducting Bruckner's Fifth. I mean, I'm a classical music, but that's a banger, right? And you'd love it, I'll tell you. Especially the third movement. Anyway. And of course, they had all of the reviews. And amongst the reviews, what a wonderful night had been had by all, and how delightful, my language, I think, that Karl Böhm had stuck to the original tempo. And also, I think there's some Richard Strauss on. Of course, those concert goers on that night, who had, granted it's the Anschluss, but had experienced the impact, albeit in Austria, but nevertheless, what had sort of filtered through from Germany of beginning of women's rights and sort of, gay clubs, etc., Berlin and the world of cabaret, felt that they were living in the cutting edge. They sort of looked down on the rest of us as the world of Beethoven and Schiller, right? And there you have it, of Bruckner. And as they walked out theatre, the concert hall on that night, a great night had by all. It was Kristallnacht.
Wow, of course, yes.
They would have been in reaching and smelling distance of the burning synagogue.
Wow.
Right.
Yes, that's incredible.
All of them in the modern world. And so I guess I'm so grateful to talk to you today. And yes, if you get the chance to visit Auschwitz, you must go. But I always invite people to think that the Nazi guards there, let's say they're, I don't know, 23 in 1944, right? In 1934, they're 13 and 12, or even 21, right? 11. So it takes a long time, a process of dehumanization, of the usurpation, the taking over of democracy under the rule of law, all of that stuff before you end up being a Nazi guard in Auschwitz. And that we need to remember this didn't happen in some backwater. It happened against the backdrop of democracy and modernity.
Well, yes, I've got two things I'd like to say. The first thing is, and this is something that Alan and I have already discussed, but it's something that's just completely on my mind at the moment. And I've been thinking about it all week, which is this, how extraordinary it is that the German people, who are so sophisticated, you think about the music, the literature, the art, the engineering, the science, the modernity that has emerged out of Germany in the 100 years leading up to 1933 and beyond. It's absolutely extraordinary. And how could they have descended into this so quickly? So that's the first point. And the second point is that I've just been reading a really, really very disturbing new book by Lawrence Rees. And Lawrence Rees was the chap who produced and directed the Nazis: A Warning from History for the BBC, this sort of iconic series, maybe 20, 30 years ago now. And has done a lot of work subsequent to that. And he interviewed all that last generation of Nazis before they died. So people who'd been in the bunker with Hitler at the end and all this kind of stuff, and people who were completely unrepentant about it. So he's got a very interesting perspective on it. And he's just written this book called The Nazi Mind, and sort of 12 Warnings from History. And it's all about how it's stepping stones, it's steps from getting, forks in the road and taking the wrong turn, and that descent and how you get there. And what's so frightening about it is so much of the early steps we're in at the moment. And it's so worrying.
Well, there are resonances to be sure, right? But that's why programs like this, that's why talking about it, that's why exactly as you've described, this sort of step-by-step process is so vital. And the most important thing is two elements: our values, gratitude for democracy under the rule of law, and constant vigilance and no complacency, right?
Yeah.
No complacency. That's the word. That's the word.
Right.
Don't be complacent, because I worry we are getting a bit complacent.
Well, perhaps we are. I mean, that's what modernity does, right? And consequent indifference, not my responsibility.
There's no guarantee of anything, modernity, is it?
It's the opposite. I mean, I stood I remember I was reporting on the border, Ukraine and Poland. It was an extraordinary moment as I turned around and was speaking to someone collecting their story in Russian. And the next thing, she told me this terrible story. And I realized that the place I was standing in, which was now a refugee reception center, a week before had been a mega Tesco's. It was a mega Tesco's. Nobody in that part of the world, right, in Poland, in Medyka, thought anything other than that road into Ukraine was for the foreseeable, limitless future, just a safe road. And yet it's become something totally different, less than a blink of an eye ago. But it's interesting, you talked before about Rees's new book. When people ask me what should they read,
yeah, where do you begin?
Right. With students and, friends, I usually say the first thing is Christopher Browning's Ordinary Men, funny enough. I'm not sure if, Al, you've read it.
Yes, I have, yeah.
It's behind me somewhere.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Do you understand why?
Yeah.
It tells a story of these sort of ordinary men that end up in the Einsatz group. So we talk about, and it's important to share the story of Auschwitz, but we forget the Holocaust by bullets, which a number of my family were also killed in, especially in the Eastern Front, in Barbarossa in the first days, right? And beyond, in Baba Yar and other places of
33,000. 33,000.
That's just in Baba Yar. Now, I remember standing in Von Reva making the program. And just before that, I'd interviewed the woman who's the last living eyewitness to what had happened. And I'm not a great Russian speaker, but I speak enough. And it's a curious thing because it doesn't have a direct or indirect article. There's no or the. So if you're translating your head, it's a bit like being punched in the stomach.
I never knew that.
It's quite brusque. It feels brusque, in my head anyway. And she said, describing the mass grave that my family had been murdered in, she said the mound was moving 2 days later. It's not everybody was dead, you see. It doesn't take much imagination. And then I was told I was going to a memorial. This is in the program. I assumed I'd be going to a standard Soviet memorial, which you see dotted about Russia when you were able to go, and it would say the heroes of the Soviet Union and Cyrillic, and it never refers to any particular ethnic groups and stuff. But this, it turned out, there was a ring fence piece of earth surrounded almost by this, like I say, a kind of picket fence, and it was the precise mound. And nothing had grown over it. And they put the camera on, they said, well, what do you think now? And I've no memory until I watched it back as to what I said, till they played it back to me. And my response, which I'm still surprised by, but I think is right. I think, it was overwhelming, but to think that that's not the only dark mound of earth like that on our shared earth. That's the thing that I couldn't get over then, and I continue to struggle with now, I think.
We've been talking about it this week. When you're confronted by the facts of it, they are, on the boundaries of understanding, aren't they? We've talked about the steps towards the Holocaust happening. But when you're confronted with it, you think, what possible steps could bring you here? What possible series of events and changes and contingencies could bring you to this place and these events? And in a sense, it's sort of mysterious in a way, isn't it?
Do you think it is, Al? I think there's a danger of placing mystery around it. I mean, what I love about you guys is actually you forensically kind of break it down and decloak that mystery,
I think what I'm trying to say is this is how it can appear.
Oh, I see.
But actually, when you do look at the bones of it, you can see how it accelerates to where it ends up.
Yeah.
The process is at work, the intent is there, and the opportunity.
Well, I mean, I've always thought it's a rather kind of straightforward alchemy, right? I mean, you've got catastrophic global events, the aftermath of the Wall Street crash, hyperinflation, and the toxic fallout of all of the issues of the First World War. But that's a big one, right? Can't afford anything. And you've got, the wrong guy at the right place at the wrong time, and able to point at people to say whose fault it is.
One of the big arguments in the Lawrence Rees book,
Yeah.
this new one, The Nazi Mind, is one of the attractions of the Nazis was this idea of them and us. We're all together, they're the enemy, and they're other. You're with or you're against. There's no kind of middle ground. There's no kind of, actually, come on, let's all just be pals together kind of thing.
Yeah.
And obviously it doesn't take a huge leap to realize there's a huge resonance of that with the kind of Trumpian view of America. It's exactly what he's been trying to do. That's what MAGA's about. And it's sort of, it's scary.
Well, even if you don't think that, right, which I mean, because I want to sort of bring it into the MAGA world, you might be right about that. Genuinely, I've given it some thought to be sure. Everybody should be troubled about how we ended up at that building in Auschwitz, right?
Yeah.
And the other element, which is really important, is them having all of these new mediums of communication, right? And that's seriously critical as well.
Yes. Radio. I mean, there were more radios in Germany per person than any other country in the world, including the United States in 1939.
That's so interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, isn't it? And so they realized that if you can make cheap radios, then you can pummel out the same message. And of course, it's a message which is full of lies. But if you say it often enough, people start to believe it.
But that's the thing. And so I guess where the connective tissue is, where you should worry is when the state starts changing the school curricula to other people, etc. That's the stuff. And when what you can say in court is effective, when there's no separation between the state and the judiciary, and freedom of speech is curtailed, etc. Those are the step-by-step things that anybody listening to needs to reflect on, think about, and muse on before we end up at that building with Arbeit macht frei over it.
Rob, you said that Auschwitz is the end of the story.
I mean, it's a terrible, enduring story, but you know what I mean.
That story, rather.
Yeah.
I think we should come back after the break and talk about the beginnings that follow for your family, because there's a remarkable story of the Windermere children. We'll be back in a second. Welcome back to We Have Ways of Making You Talk with me, Murray and James Holland. And we're talking to Rob Rinder about the Holocaust and memory and where that's taken us. And what a fascinating conversation so far. I guess this articulate and thoughtful
is a treat.
That can't be true. I know that's not
a treat. I'm going to say a treat.
Well, no, it's fascinating. We want interesting conversations, don't we?
We don't have drunks on most of the time, do
No,
we?
we don't. Well, that has happened. Normally, we're talking about a campaign, we're talking about a battle or some technology or something. But to talk about this sort of, ruminatively is very, very interesting. And as I said, you said Auschwitz is the sort of end of the story, of that story. And then there's the beginning. And for your family, the new beginning is coming here.
Yeah, Windermere.
Your grandfather, which is an amazing story.
The Windermere children, amazing. What a lovely place to go to. I mean,
Isn't
Lake
it?
District is one of my favourite places on the planet.
He described it once as arriving in heaven.
How wonderful.
And if you think about it, he'd survived slave labor in various camps. One of them, I go back to the story.
He was at Theresienstadt, wasn't he?
He was liberated in Theresienstadt. Before that, he'd been in Schlieffen. I remember coming back from school and saying, I got to the front of the queue in somewhere, pushed in, and he was livid. And I couldn't understand why he was so angry. And that's just because there were 3 queues when he arrived at Schlieffen, 3 lines, and he was put into like line C, he was a canny guy. He realized that was the hard work. So he, typical him, pushed himself into the first line. And a Nazi guard discovered him, saw him and beat him, and he still had the scar on his face and on his back. Anyway, the long and short is that sometime later he discovered that first line, they were working inside, so it's easier work, but they were working with toxic chemicals without any protective gear, so life expectancy was about 2 or 3 months. But even though he was doing the hard work, there was just the thin possibility of living, which he did. So for him, the message was, don't push yourself forward unless you know what's at the front of the queue, right? That just came out of that story, right? Having been through that, he, along with about 732 survivors, children survivors.
So how old was he in 1945?
Well, we don't know. You've asked him what year he was born. He'd say in Tu B'Shvat, which is a Jewish festival, harvest festival for trees, which is, so February we know, and there's a record that it's 1922. So he would have lied. He did lie about his age, no doubt. He lied to get in here.
Just go back a notch, Rob. So it's the end of the war. There's these Jewish teenagers, 18, 19, aren't they? Something like that?
Children across the board. No, they're supposed to be children. That's the deal.
Okay, so under 18.
Exactly. The relevant organization, which is still going, I think World Jewish Relief at that point, now is what it is, they make a deal with the government. They're going to bring some of the child survivors from Terezin over to the UK, give them temporary visas for them to go elsewhere.
And I should just say that Terezin and Theresienstadt are the same place.
They are now in the Czech Republic. And the temporary visas was, as I say, they were either going to go to America or to what was then Palestine. But they come to Windermere not just broken. I mean, I've stood on that place in Schlieffen and in the winter with a coat on and with gloves and the lot. And there's being cold and there's freezing that goes into your bones that interferes with the chemistry of your soul in some way. And there's being hungry and there's having no food. I still don't have the capacity, the imagination, the human gift, I think, to understand how you would have survived that. But he did. Having starved and diseased, and with all of these kids, variety of age, from very, very young children to people up to sort of, he pretended to be, I think, 15, but he would have been about 18, or I thought at that point. And they arrive in Windermere. And if you've ever been to Windermere on a crisp day with a blue sky and seen that lake, he thought he'd arrived in heaven. That's what it looked like in his mind. And it's such a gift to talk about Windermere and about Cumbria and the Lake District, because often, when we talk about the experience of receiving refugees, it's a kind of urban experience, cities and so on and so forth. And we forget to kind of acknowledge, that's why I'm so proud of this part of the world, that actually this community of Jews, they'd never met a Jew, seen a Jew, they knew nothing really about these young people they were about to encounter and experience. They didn't really know much about what they'd been through, but nevertheless, they gifted their space, their time, their earth, to heal these young people. And that's where his sort of journey started. And he had this, not only was he sort of healed here, but he ended up being imbued with, I think it's an over thought out way of describing it, but he had this passionate love of Britain, England especially. I mean, there's a kind of love of democracy under the rule of law that was a real love, in the way that only somebody perhaps who's touched the face of tyranny really has. We get it for free. When we were kids, we used to take my brother and I to Speaker's Corner. And sometimes there'd be people standing there, and this was pre-Twitter, when you could stare into the face of shouting out human debris. And eventually would go on to represent some of them as a barrister, right? Genuinely. And he'd say things, and they'd often be spouting anti-Semitic bile. And he'd say, I never forget, he spoke with a very thick Polish accent. You see, Hess, you see, in this country, this man can say what he wants. And it meant something to him. It was visceral. You know what I mean? It was, And he learnt all of that. All of that stuff came from arriving in heaven in Cumbria.
Well, it is heaven. I mean, it still is. I mean, it's such a beautiful, beautiful part of the world. Goodness me. Well, what an amazing thing. What an opportunity as well. I mean, how do you adjust, though, from what you've been through to suddenly you're in heaven? I mean, I don't know. I don't know how you can't, can you?
I don't think you do really.
It's with you forever. It's what you were saying about that chap, that poor chap who was in the Sonderkommando that you were quoting, Al.
It is.
His life was a sort of shroud of depression, and it was just there. It was ever present. He just couldn't get away from it.
But that entire generation, the generation that you focus on, were traumatized. There's an entire trauma that went on to go and then parent. In my grandfather's case, I mean, he had deep trauma, and that would manifest itself in a variety of different ways, from his eccentricities to his curious sort of open-mindedness, despite being a devout and religious Jew. I mean, he would do these things. He'd disappear and go to a mosque for an afternoon. Or he'd take my brother and I on holiday. We're posh. I mean, I sound like I've been mugged by a Mitford, but actually I grew up in Southgate. This all sort of started when I was 3, But genuinely, it's complete artifice. We'd go on holiday to Bournemouth and he'd disappear for a day. And because he was a baker, that was his family's job for generations in Pietrzkov. He'd go and can we say bugger off? I just did. And got to get a job in Greg's or whatever it was, a local bakery for a day. And he was bonkers and fascinating, but at the same time, really without question damaged.
Did you know that at the time? Did
yeah.
you sense that as a child? You just sensed it. You knew it.
Yeah, I think for the second generation and the third generation, the grandchildren, it's much easier. I think a lot of people listening to this, if they've got or they've had the privilege of having perhaps a Second World War veteran or a survivor in their family, often the grandchildren get a lot more out of that person than the children.
Well, I think that's very, very true. And I think one of the things that happens is because of so many people who were returning from the war, they were not that uncommon. I mean, literally everyone was in their position. And so then they want to kind of get married, have their kids and get on with their life and have a normal kind of non-military career for the most cases. And yet, they see their children growing up and constant references to in the war, you wouldn't have been able to have that much butter on your jam, on your bread.
But you compartmentalize and you don't ask about the difficult things.
You do compartmentalize, but for your son and daughter, it's just, that's just something that happened. It's like a reference point. It's not something of any great interest because everyone else's parents are in the same book.
I wonder whether that's true. I wonder whether there's something much more complex and dark than that.
There is a kind of unwritten rule that no one talks about it.
You don't ask. Because it's just too much. It's beyond where language can go.
But also, a father doesn't want their children to think of them in that light. Whether you're being persecuted as a Jew in a concentration camp or worse, or as someone who's been, fighting across Northwest Europe and killing Germans.
Well, the realities of combat are so horrendous.
Whereas in combat, you just don't want to think about it. And the person who's been through it doesn't want their daughter or son to think of them in that light. They want to think of them as their father. I think a lot of people, it gets blocked off. And then also the other thing is by the time you've got grandchildren, your professional life is either over or on the way to be over. And suddenly you've got more time as a veteran to think about these things and contemplate your life and contemplate the experiences you went through. And I mean, the amount of people I met who I never talked about this, and then suddenly got a letter through from a bloke who'd been on my ship, and he said, did I want to come to reunion? And I didn't go the first year, but then the second year I thought, all right, well, why not? And actually then he got into it and suddenly he starts talking about it and finds it's actually easier to talk about than he thought it was. And suddenly it all starts to come out. But, everyone's different, but I think there are common threads about how people dealt with what they've been through and how the next generation and generation beyond dealt with that. So I think your experience is rare, but I think there are patterns which follow a norm.
There's a real pattern, especially amongst the survivor community, that I can really speak to, that's really a common theme. I mean, what language do you use to say your 7-year-old sister, the youngest, and 3 others, and your brother and your parents were gassed? What can you possibly say? What do you do after that? How do you form a relationship? How can you possibly be normal? If you imagine that just as a tragedy or a vicious form of violence on its own, and you were to meet somebody who had experienced that, there'd be whispers about, there's a person over there whose entire family were killed. And that person then goes on to become a parent. And what's interesting, across generations, including the veterans who return, we now know certainly the generations of second generation of survivors, we now know that trauma sits in our RNA. And that sort of makes biological sense, right? It's why a gazelle gets up and understands it's time to run away from the lion. That this trauma they experience is inherited, it's passed down. And you see common reactions often in the second generation, my mum's community. Many are quite claustrophobic and so on and so forth. They worry about being near home. I mean, when my grandfather died, he died having some comfort and success none of us knew, because he sort of walked around with plastic bags. He used to be a kosher caterer and a baker, but he'd get up every morning at 4 and bake cakes. And it's such a pity I've got no transferable skills whatsoever. You'd think, but, food. I talked about earlier about being hungry, right? And this was a poignant moment that I'll never forget. As he was dying, in his bungalow in Southgate with my wonderful grandma who survived the blips, everything that you think of when you think of strong East End woman, Cockney. Dotted about drawers and the backs of wardrobes were little handkerchiefs, napkins with food in them all over the place.
Gosh, he'd been stashing food.
Just in case.
Goodness me.
Just in case. When we went away, if we were going on a plane or something, he'd have food in his bag, just in case. Again, because if you know what it is to have been truly hungry, not just fleetingly hungry, that's a fear that you don't ever get over. And the other curious thing, which I don't think I've really ever spoken about, but I suppose it's relevant to you guys and to this discussion, and this is something I've never really understood. And my brother will be listening to this because he is a religious listener to you guys. He wasn't a sort of voracious reader, except in the cupboard, I'm looking at it now in Southgate. So Craig, if you're listening, he'll know a wardrobe full of Second World War books, of everything. And he'd talk to anybody, as long as it wasn't us. But I mean, it was as if he had this thirst to retrospectively understand. And the only video box set he had was The World at War.
Well, if you're going to have one video box set,
I know, it's a good one, that's true.
Gosh, how extraordinary.
Amazing. Do you feel like you inherited some of that trauma, do you think, in some way?
Probably. I think it changes or rather, it doesn't dilute. It's just less personal the longer down the generations it goes.
But are you haunted by your family's experiences?
No, I feel empowered by it, actually.
Do you? Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, I feel like I've been able, because he didn't parent me, to take the best bit of him.
Because you must also be incredibly proud of what he did.
Oh, well, yeah, proud to be sure, but I was proud of him for all sorts of reasons. But it's really interesting. If anyone has the opportunity to ever be along with survivors, and sadly, because it's the 80th anniversary, they are disappearing. But moments ago, as I'm speaking to you now, I just saw Marla Tribbich from the same town as my grandfather, and she lifts up her arm. She has a number on it. And what's fascinating is when you leave that moment with her, there's two things that are sort of overwhelming. First of all, if you ever see them around a kind of buffet table, they delight in life with a richness that you just won't encounter amongst any other community. The only time I ever saw my grandfather sort of happy and full of joy, when he wasn't sort of going crazy at various things, was if he was at a wedding or a bar mitzvah. They were like thirsty for the experience of joy. Again, when you've had the privation of having nothing, to be in a moment of celebration, it was as if he was sort of drinking it in. That was one thing. And the other thing is, people often ask you, how did someone survive? And the answer, of course, in nearly all cases is luck, right? Unless you had a special talent, such, but, Primo Levi, for example, had a particular scientific skill. But I always think the connective tissue between all the survivors is it doesn't really translate. It's both a Yiddish and a Hebrew word. It's davka. And what it means is to be contrarian. But I don't mean sort of silly davka, not silly, where you meet some fool who, you're like the sky, the type, the sky is blue, no, it's green, I want to argue about it. That's davka, that's contrarian. It's much deeper than that. It's where the world around you has determined to write your story, and you grab back the pen and you absolutely decide that you are going to write the chapters of your own novel. In other words, you hold your destiny in your hand. It's Dovka, you're contrarian to the world. And it's fascinating when you spend time with the survivors, they're all like that in that way. They are muscly Dovka. And it's, for me, what I've taken from my grandfather, in the work that I used to do as a barrister especially, was, standing between the individual and the state. And Dovka, because not just because my responsibility and all of the things about democracy we're talking about, which I hold sacred, and I know most of us do, but also because it's important to be contrarian. That can make you survive.
Oh, there's lots to chew on there, isn't there, Jim?
There's a hell of a lot to chew on. I'm still thinking about the mound that you were standing by. I have no Jewish blood in me at all. I have no connection to it at all. But obviously, I have a big connection.
Well, we all were at some point,
Well, yes,
who knows?
Of course,
Well,
of course.
yes, exactly.
But, no recent. And so I'm not directly connected to the Holocaust. But I feel really haunted by, it's the same thought, but it's different, which is the photo of the mother shielding her child about to be shot in Ukraine. I think it's 1942.
I know the photo you're talking about.
Yeah, anyone who's looked at this will know that photograph. It's so completely grotesque and awful and tragic. And yet there is love there in this moment of complete horror and hatred. But it's awful. And then you think about the gas chambers, and I suppose the thing that haunts me is the thought that people know what's about to happen to them.
Yes, that haunts me a bit.
And they're powerless to do anything about it. So you're in the gas chamber, you suddenly realise what's going on. And as Al and I have been discussing this week, it could take 20 minutes to die in the gas chamber. And that woman clutching her child knows what's about to happen. What is the scramble that's going through your brain at that moment? How do you cope and how do you deal with what is about to come and which is about to take place?
Yeah.
And that's the thing that haunts me.
That's fascinating. You said, does it haunt me? And I said no, but it actually, because of the work that we've made as a community, the various production teams make the various documentaries, those stories are really ones that have affected me. The woman who arrives at Sobibor, so obviously before they use Cyclone B, and the gas chambers are using carbon monoxide. And at that point, she looks up and she knows what's about to happen to her. And she says to a Nazi guard, "How long will it take?" And there's something about that question from time to time that I can't kind of move beyond. So I have to put it away and put it in the box, as we do with difficult things that don't have answers. But there's something else. It's strange you should bring it up. I've just been at the Anne Frank Memorial Trust lunch, where, in fact, I'm speaking to you from. And Stephen Fry was here telling a story from Anita Lasker-Wulfisch, who some of you may know. She's a cellist in Auschwitz. So she survived because she could play the cello, and she played in the women's band there, conducted, by the way, by the niece of Mahler. You think about that for a second. And one day, and I don't want to ruin the story because I will, because Stephen Fry told it so beautifully, but the story wasn't the point. He told the story about how Mengele had come to find her in the barrack and invited her to play, and she played some, I think, Schubert. And then she'd left, and she'd written a very, very cross, angry letter to Stephen Fry because he'd told the story, but he'd added bits to it, as one does, to make the story sound more dramatic and that people might listen. He said it with all, noble intent. And the reason she was a little bit cross that he'd placed a window in the scene. I mean, it was as small as that, or that Mengele had come as opposed to a functionary to go and collect her to tell her to play, is because she said truth mattered. And the most important thing, which is right about, the most important thing was that when he told the story, he said to her, "Well, at the end of this playing, did he thank you?" And she looked at him, cross. What an absurd question. I mean, he wouldn't thank me any more than he'd thank his washing machine or his desk. So, when we talk about how difficult it is to understand that mother in arms with a baby, is that by the time these things happen, people have been dehumanized to such an extent that they've been denuded of any vestige of human status. And so when you get into that mindset, which is an important, terrible mental and emotional gymnastics to do, it kind of becomes clearer. But yeah, it's just horrifying. And for me as a as a Jew of faith as well, the other haunting thing is that one prayer, like it's a bit like the Lord's Prayer, or you might know one thing as a Christian, you might perhaps be able to recite a hymn from school, but nearly all Jews, regardless of your level, let's say, of devotion, will know Shema Yisrael. Here it's like the main prayer, it's the big one. And I used to hear very often of the accounts of some of the survivors of those atrocities, that people would often be reciting that would be the last prayer on their lips, and I find that very haunting.
Gosh. Well, Rob, thank you so much for talking to us today.
Yes,
for talking about truth and Davka, plurality and memory. And
your grandfather Morris, he sounds like an amazing fellow.
Your grandfather coming to heaven and in Windermere. And if people want to engage with this more, where would you recommend they look?
Where to start? I'd love them to go to the 45 Aid Society website. 45 Aid, spelled 45 with the number. And it's the big organization that my mum runs. And why it's so wonderful is that it's all of the descendants, families from those who survived in Windermere. And it's wonderful. I'd love you guys to come. Actually, we have a reunion once a year, and there's thousands that show up. And it's not a charity event. It's people from political life, from the arts. Everybody comes and with the survivors, and we dance and celebrate.
Amazing. It sounds incredible.
And it has all of the survivor stories, but it's that. And whilst it's essential to reflect on all of the things, I'm so proud of you for what it's worth that you've been sharing with your listeners and with everybody. I also think it's important to come away from these stories with hope and with courage. Because, I can't think, Maya Angelou, wasn't it? He said, you can't practice any of the virtues consistently without courage. It's easy to come away from Auschwitz thinking, oh, well, shrug your shoulders, think what I can do. Actually, quite a lot, and it begins and ends with you. So go on the 45 Aid Society and have a read, I think.
Tremendous. Well, thank you so much for joining
us.
Thank you,
and thanks for having me.
An absolute pleasure. Well, thank you, everyone, for listening. We hope you've found this as fascinating as we have.
Absolutely. Well, we don't have guests on that often, do we? And very rarely one as brilliant as you, Rob. So
oh, you're lovely. I've got to go and run and get into my silly gear. Anyway, lots of love. Be well, both of you. And again, thank you so much for having me.
It's our pleasure. Thanks very much, everyone, for listening. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.